When a narcissistic woman realizes that her usual emotional strategies no longer move you, something profound begins to shift inside her, often in ways she did not anticipate. Narcissistic behavior thrives on emotional volatility. It feeds on reactions, on the chaos of conflict, on the predictable pattern of you defending yourself, explaining yourself, or trying to prove your good intentions. But when you respond with a steady, composed compassion, you interrupt the entire psychological ecosystem she depends on. You take away the fuel, and without fuel the fire cannot burn. Your calmness is not weakness. It is a psychological boundary. It signals that you are not entering the emotional arena where she holds the advantage. And because you refuse to participate in the emotional game, she cannot derive what Jung called psychic energy from your responses. Instead, she is forced to sit with her own unresolved insecurities, something she has spent her entire life avoiding. Compassion, in this sense, is not merely kindness, it is clarity. It is the ability to see her behavior without becoming entangled in it. This creates an internal disruption for her. When manipulation fails, the narcissistic personality experiences what some psychologists describe as a temporary identity collapse. She cannot understand why her tactics aren't working. She becomes confused, unsettled, and even threatened, not by aggression, but by your emotional stability. When you do not react, she loses her script. When you stay calm, she loses her leverage. And when you maintain compassion, she loses the illusion that she has moral superiority. This is the moment when many narcissists change their approach. Some become quieter, others become defensive, and some attempt new tactics, hoping to pull you back into the emotional drama. But your consistency, your refusal to mirror her chaos, forces a new dynamic she cannot control. She begins to recognize that she cannot bend your emotions, and that realization alone challenges the core of her inflated self-image. And ironically, it is your compassion, not confrontation, that delivers the most powerful blow to her sense of dominance, because it shows her a version of strength she cannot dismantle. In the end, the most transformative truth is this: when you stop reacting, she starts revealing who she truly is. There comes a moment when your compassion stops feeling like something gentle to her, and instead becomes something deeply unsettling. And it's important to understand why. A narcissistic woman often constructs her identity on a fragile foundation, an inner world built on fear, insecurity, and an unspoken belief that she is never enough. To protect that fragile foundation, she creates a psychological mask, a version of herself she wants the world to believe. But compassion, real compassion, doesn't interact with that mask, sees right through it, and that is precisely why it unnerves her. When you approach her with empathy instead of anger, with understanding instead of retaliation, she cannot use the mask to control the situation. Your compassion bypasses her defenses and exposes the emotional wounds she fights so fiercely to hide. Jung often emphasized that what we reject or avoid eventually becomes the shadow we must confront. Your presence, grounded in patience and clarity, becomes a mirror reflecting back the parts of herself she has disowned, the insecurity, the guilt, the fear of inadequacy. And few things threaten a narcissist more than being seen accurately. She may interpret your compassion as an attack, not because it is aggressive, but because it reveals her vulnerability. Her tactics depend on distortion, distorting facts, distorting emotions, distorting your perception of yourself. But compassion restores clarity. It becomes harder for her to twist your intentions when you consistently respond with emotional maturity. It becomes harder for her to manipulate the narrative when you refuse to enter the realm of drama. And it becomes impossible for her to hide from her own behavior when your calmness illuminates every contradiction she tries to conceal. This confrontation with truth often triggers defensiveness. She may lash out, withdraw, or redefine the situation in an attempt to regain control. But the psychological impact remains. She is forced to face the dissonance between who she pretends to be and who she truly is. And though she may never admit it, your compassion challenges her more deeply than any conflict ever could. You are not fighting her. You are simply refusing to participate in a shared illusion. What ultimately unsettles her is that compassion reveals authenticity, and authenticity is something she has spent her entire life avoiding, and that is the quiet power you hold. When you stand in truth, her mask begins to fall. There is a particular moment in any relationship with a narcissistic woman when she realizes that her ego no longer determines your emotional state, and this moment is psychologically pivotal. You see, narcissistic behavior is sustained by what Jung might describe as a constant need for external affirmation, an ongoing attempt to stabilize an inner void. When you used to react, defend yourself, or try to justify your intentions, she could feed off that emotional energy. Every argument, every apology, every attempt to win her approval reinforced her inflated sense of control. But when you detach from that cycle, when you stop seeking her validation and instead trust your own emotional compass, you disrupt the hidden system she depends on. This is where your strength becomes quietly revolutionary. She expects resistance. She expects anger. She expects you to fall into the familiar pattern of trying to win her back or prove your loyalty. What she does not expect is your calm refusal to participate. When you withdraw your need for her approval, you take away something far more valuable than attention. You take away relevance. Without that relevance, her ego begins to crack. She may not show it, at least not openly. Narcissistic personalities rarely acknowledge vulnerability, but internally she begins to feel destabilized. Her usual strategies, silent treatments, emotional baiting, or calculated guilt, no longer land the way they once did. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of defending, you stay grounded. Instead of collapsing into self-doubt, you remain centered in your own worth. This shift forces her to confront a truth she cannot easily escape. She has lost influence over you, and this, more than anything, shakes her sense of superiority. When her attempts to dominate the emotional landscape fail, she begins to sense a loss of control. The absence of your reaction deprives her of the psychological leverage she relies on. It exposes the fragility of her persona, the ego-constructed identity that cannot exist without external confirmation. In your steadiness, she encounters something unfamiliar and unsettling, someone she cannot manipulate. And yet, this is where your compassion continues to matter. You are not punishing her, you are simply choosing yourself. You are allowing her ego to collapse under its own weight without adding to the damage. And in that choice lies a deeper, more transformative strength. Because the real turning point is this: when you stop chasing her approval, she must finally face herself. There is a subtle but profound shift that occurs when you begin setting boundaries, not through conflict, but through calm, compassionate firmness. This is the moment when a narcissistic woman starts to feel something she rarely experiences: the loss of emotional access. Boundaries challenge her precisely because they introduce limitations in a territory where she once operated freely. And the more consistent and gentle those boundaries are, the more they reveal the truth she has long denied, that you are not hers to control. A narcissistic woman interprets boundaries as a threat, not because they are harsh or punitive, but because they dismantle her belief in her own entitlement. For years, she may have shaped relationships around the idea that others must accommodate her emotions, her narrative, her needs. But when you calmly declare what is acceptable and what is not, you interrupt that narrative. You create a psychological distance she cannot easily cross. And unlike anger or confrontation, boundaries anchored in compassion give her no excuse to paint herself as the victim. They leave her face to face with her own behavior. This is where Jung's insights become relevant. He suggested that true growth comes from encountering limits, those internal and external markers that force the psyche to confront its own structure. Your boundaries serve as those markers for her. They show her where her influence ends. They reveal where your self-respect begins, and because you enforce them without hostility, they expose her strategies in a way she cannot comfortably ignore. Initial reaction is often panic, though it may emerge as irritation, withdrawal, or sudden emotional intensity. The panic does not come from the boundary itself. It comes from the realization that the familiar mechanisms of control no longer function. She cannot guilt you into compliance. She cannot twist the story. She cannot push you into emotional turmoil. Instead, she must adapt, often reluctantly, to a reality where your autonomy is stronger than her manipulation. What unsettles her most is not the boundary, but the serenity with which you hold it. That quiet steadiness communicates something she has never wanted to acknowledge. You have stepped out of the psychological fog she once kept you in. You have chosen clarity over chaos. And clarity is the one thing she cannot overpower. In the end, your boundaries are more than limits. They are declarations of your inner strength. And the moment she realizes she cannot break them is the moment everything begins to change. Because the truth is simple. When you stand firm with compassion, you reclaim the space she once controlled. There is a noticeable shift in her behavior the moment your inner strength becomes visible, not through aggression or dominance, but through a quiet, centered confidence that cannot be shaken. This kind of strength is rare, and for a narcissistic woman it is deeply threatening. She has constructed her identity around the belief that she is superior, that her emotional volatility grants her power, and that others exist to orbit around her needs. But when she encounters a person who does not collapse under pressure, who does not bend to emotional extremes, and who refuses to mirror her instability, her entire psychological staging begins to unravel. Your authenticity challenges her in a way conflict never could. When you remain grounded, she can no longer project her insecurities onto you. When you remain truthful, she cannot distort the narrative without being confronted by its contradictions. And when you remain emotionally stable, she loses access to the roles she usually assigns: victim, hero, or persecutor. Roles she manipulates to control the dynamic. Instead, she is forced into an uncomfortably honest encounter with herself. Jung would say that the persona, the mask we show the world, begins to crack whenever it can no longer maintain its illusion. Your strength is what creates that crack. What complicates this experience for her is that your strength is compassionate rather than combative. She cannot justify attacking someone who is not attacking her. She cannot claim moral superiority when you are operating from clarity and emotional maturity. So instead, she often becomes defensive, sarcastic, or dismissive, not because your behavior is wrong, but because it exposes the inconsistencies in her own. You become the mirror she never wanted to look into, reflecting back the insecurity that underlies her arrogance, the fragility beneath her confidence, the fear hidden behind her bravado. In a way, your presence becomes a psychological test she cannot pass. It reveals how dependent her sense of power is on your emotional reactions. It exposes how fragile her superiority becomes when met with true self-respect. And the more you stand firm in your identity, the more she realizes that her dominance was never real. It was borrowed from your willingness to participate in her world. This is why she feels threatened. Not by you, but by what you represent, the end of her illusion. And that is the deeper truth to hold on to. When you rise in your own strength, you illuminate the weakness she has worked her entire life to hide. There comes a point in this entire psychological dance where something undeniable happens. She begins to respect you, not because you demanded it, not because you outmaneuvered her, but because you rose above her emotional battlefield entirely. Narcissistic personalities rarely respect force. They fear it, they fight it, or they try to imitate it. But they do respect something far more unsettling to them: a person who cannot be pulled into their chaos, who cannot be shaped by their moods, and who refuses to abandon compassion even when provoked. That combination is so foreign to her usual relational dynamics that it forces a kind of grudging recognition. She begins to realize that her familiar tools, guilt, intimidation, emotional unpredictability, simply don't work on you anymore. And once she realizes she cannot control you, she faces a kind of existential dilemma. Either she adapts or she loses access to you completely. Narcissists rely heavily on predictability in others. They rely on emotional patterns they can exploit. But when those patterns disappear, when you respond with maturity she cannot destabilize, she has to acknowledge that the power dynamic has changed. She may not articulate it, but she feels it. She senses that your strength is not situational but internal, not reactive but rooted in who you have become. This is where your compassion, ironically, becomes the factor that elevates you even further in her perception. You do not humiliate her, you do not retaliate, you do not try to win. You simply hold yourself with integrity. And integrity, especially in the face of manipulation, is something she cannot fabricate for herself. It is a trait she cannot counterfeit. She might mimic empathy, she might mimic confidence, but she cannot mimic groundedness. Only someone who has wrestled with their own inner world and come out with a deeper clarity can embody that. In the quiet space between her tactics failing and your stability remaining intact, she is forced into a kind of internal recalibration. She must either step back or step up, because she cannot bring you down. And for the first time she sees that you are not simply resisting her. You are beyond the reach of her emotional gravity altogether. And that is when the dynamic transforms, because your presence no longer fuels her, it humbles her. Remember this truth: when you rise above her games, she has no choice but to confront the limits of her own power.